Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. Today, we are strapping in for quite an intellectual journey. It starts with this grand promise, almost like solving the universe. And it ends, maybe a bit awkwardly, with something like an apology. We're diving deep into the history and the core arguments within the philosophy of language.
It's a fascinating field, and its history is, well, a bit strange, isn't it? Almost cyclical.
Yeah, cyclical is a good word. You have this period where philosophers seemed convinced that language was the master key, the key to unlocking all sorts of metaphysical and epistemological puzzles.
Absolutely. The ambitions were huge.
But then fast forward, and you get figures like Richard Rorty, decades later, almost backtracking. He basically apologized for having led philosophers to think language was that central, that philosophically interesting.
Right. It's quite a turn. Rorty suggesting maybe the whole focus was a bit misplaced. And then on the flip side, you have people from linguistics, like computational linguists, Barbara Partee, for instance. They look at philosophy now and essentially say, look, you guys can't really do serious work in semantics anymore unless you have this incredibly sophisticated technical grasp of syntax.
So they're not saying it's uninteresting.
No, not at all. They're saying philosophers are sort of priced out. You need the technical chops now.
Wow. So effectively locked out from the other side.
Pretty much.
So you end up with this field that was maybe overly ambitious at one point and now perhaps seen as too technically demanding for traditional philosophy.
Yeah.
What was the source of all that massive ambition in the first place? What exactly did the philosophy of language promise back in its heyday?
Well, if you look back at, say, the latter half of the 20th century, the excitement was palpable. Language seemed to be right at the center of philosophy because it promised this direct line to understanding metaphysical reality.
How so? What was the connection?
The idea was if you could just formalize how language hooks onto the world, how it refers, then by extension, you could potentially map out the very structure of reality itself.
That's a big leap.
It is, and it came with huge claims like this approach could finally refute skepticism, the idea that we can't really know anything for sure. It was also supposed to tackle things like Cartesianism, that classic mind-body separation problem.
Okay.
And even the ancient problem of other minds. How do we know you have a mind? The thought was that the structure of our shared public language must somehow reflect or even reveal the necessary structure of thought and reality.
Wow. Language is the ultimate codebreaker for, well, everything.
Pretty much, yeah.
But that seems like an incredibly heavy burden to place on something as, let's face it, fluid and sometimes messy as everyday human communication.
It absolutely was. And, a lot was promised. But often, looking back, the accounts of language that were offered seemed shaped more by these huge philosophical agendas, metaphysics, the epistemology, rather than by just carefully observing how people actually use language.
Right. The theory came first, maybe.
Sometimes it felt that way. And the skepticism that followed, whether from postmodern thinkers or later Wittgensteinians, it really served as a necessary corrective. It kind of pulled back on those really high-flying, maybe fanciful claims.
A reality check.
Exactly. But interestingly, even the skeptics still seem to operate under the shared belief, maybe a pessimistic one, but still a belief in the fundamental importance of language for investigating reality. They just doubted it could deliver on those grand promises.
Okay, so let's try to unpack this whole epic journey for you, the listener. Our mission here is really to trace this major intellectual shift. How did we go from seeing language as this objective pathway to reality, maybe the pathway, to viewing language more as a social thing or a psychological object, something rooted in communities and practices?
That's the core trajectory.
And to do that, we need to get into the foundational figures, people like Frege, Wittgenstein, and understand this central conflict. Is meaning about objective truth conditions like a fixed link to the world?
Or is it more about how we use language, about shared rules, about what counts as making a correct assertion in a community? Truth versus use, essentially.
Right. And to really grasp how meaning was first formalized, you absolutely have to start with Gottlob Frege. His work laid down the structural foundations for basically the entire analytic tradition that followed.
Frege, yeah, his name often comes up with, let's say, a reputation for density, but his core structural idea, compositionality, that's absolutely vital, isn't it?
Oh, completely essential. Frege's really deep insight was realizing that the way sentences containing words of generality, words like all or some, the way they compose their meaning, their conceptual content, is fundamentally different from sentences without them.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, it allows us to understand how we can grasp an infinite number of sentences based on just knowing a finite number of words and a finite set of rules for combining them. That's the heart of the principle of compositionality.
We build complex meanings from simpler parts and rules. Exactly. But here's a crucial nuance. For Frege, compositionality wasn't really a theory about how our minds work psychologically, or even a direct metaphysical claim. It was primarily a semantic principle.
A principle about meaning itself.
Yes. A formal tool needed to understand how complex conceptual contents, what he famously called thoughts, are expressed by language. These thoughts, just as contents, have to be compositionally complex if we're ever going to derive the meaning of a whole sentence from the meaning of its parts and how they're put together.
Okay, that makes sense. And this focus on structure and content leads him directly to probably his most famous distinction, the difference between sense and reference. Why did he feel the need to split meaning into these two aspects?
Yeah, this was his ingenious solution to a really tricky puzzle involving identity statements. Things like A versus A, E, B. The classic example everyone uses involves astronomy. Think about these two statements. First, the morning star is the morning star.
Okay, that tells me nothing new. Completely trivial.
Right. Now compare it to the morning star is the evening star.
Ah, that's different. That was a major astronomical discovery, finding out they were the same object, the planet Venus. Highly informative.
Precisely. Now, here's the puzzle Frege faced. If the meaning of a name or description was only the object it picked out in the world, its reference, then both of those statements should be equally trivial.
Because morning star and evening star both refer to the exact same thing, Venus. So it should be like saying Venus is Venus in both cases.
Exactly. If meaning was just reference, the two sentences would express the very same uninformative thought. So Frege introduces sense die Sinn. Sense is the mode of presentation of the referent. It's kind of the cognitive pathway or the information we use to get to the referent.
So different ways of thinking about the same thing.
Right. The sense of morning star, maybe something like the brightest celestial body visible in the eastern sky before sunrises, is clearly different from the sense of evening star, the brightest celestial body visible in the western sky after sunset.
Even though the reference, the actual object, Venus, is identical.
Correct. And by distinguishing these different senses, Frege can now explain why the two sentences express different thoughts and carry different cognitive value, different information for someone learning them.
Okay, that distinction feels pretty intuitive, actually, for names and descriptions pointing to objects.
Yeah.
But then Frege takes this rather bizarre-sounding step, this puzzling doctrine that entire sentences also denote objects, and specifically they denote truth values. Wait, what? A sentence refers to the true or the false. That sounds incredibly unnatural.
It does sound unnatural, I agree. But it wasn't motivated by intuition about language use. It emerged from purely logical considerations. Frege was intensely focused on the logic of how sentences connect, using things like and, or if, then.
The logical connectives?
Yes, and he noticed something crucial about what logicians call extensional contexts. These are parts of language where substituting expressions that refer to the same thing shouldn't change the truth of the whole statement. So if you have a complex sentence, and you swap out one part for another part that has the same reference, the overall truth value of the whole sentence has to stay the same. Think about the morning star is bright. If you swap morning star for evening star, same reference, Venus, the sentence the evening star is bright should have the same truth value.
Right, because Venus is bright regardless of what we call it.
Precisely. Now, apply this to whole sentences used as parts of even larger sentences, like in if P then Q. What is the reference of a sentence P that remains constant when you swap it for another sentence R that has the same truth value?
Ah, it must be the truth value itself.
That was Frege's conclusion. Since sentences are the components whose reference determines the truth value of the whole in these logical contexts, and the only relevant feature that seems to be preserved under substitution is the ultimate truth value, well, then sentences must denote objects. And those objects are the abstract truth values, the true and the false.
Huh. So it's a requirement driven by the formal logic he was building, not by how we talk.
Exactly. It's a move that proved incredibly foundational for the development of formal logic and semantics later on, even if it feels deeply counterintuitive to think of true and false as objects that sentences point to.
Okay, so Frege gives us this incredibly structured system. It's objective, deeply logical, where language seems to either mirror or at least provide the structure for objective thought. Now let's bring in Ludwig Wittgenstein, because he famously starts off deep within this same hyperlogical tradition and then ends up pretty much dismantling it from the inside. That feels like a major philosophical, well, betrayal of his own earlier self, doesn't it?
Oh, it's a massive rupture. One of the most famous shifts in 20th century philosophy. The early Wittgenstein, the author of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, was absolutely working within and extending the Frege project. He argued even more strongly than Frege, perhaps, that language relies on a single, unified, underlying logical structure. He believed language could only make sense, could only have meaning, if it ultimately pictured facts in the world.
Okay, pictured facts.
Yes. And for this picturing relation to be possible, he concluded that the world itself, at its most fundamental level, had to consist of simple, necessarily existing, unanalyzable objects. These simples were the absolute bedrock, the ultimate reference, the condition for language having any sense at all. They couldn't be destroyed or analyzed further.
Wow. So language's meaning had to be anchored in some kind of absolute metaphysical certainty. Tiny, indestructible building blocks of reality.
That was the idea in the Tractatus. But then decades later, you get the philosophical investigations, and it's like a different philosopher entirely. He completely rejects this picture. So what was this huge transformative idea that replaced the need for these metaphysical simples? The absolutely central shift is his move away from a single perfect logic to the idea of countless overlapping indefinite language games. Think of different activities we do with words, giving orders, describing, telling jokes, asking questions.
Like different toolkits for different jobs.
Exactly. And each language game has its own local logic or grammar, its own set of rules. But the deep conceptual transition, the thing that replaces the metaphysical simples, is the pragmatic requirement for shared samples.
Samples, not simples. What's the difference?
Think about how we define 1 meter. The Tractatus view would seem to demand some abstract, necessarily existing simple object that corresponds to the concept of length or meter. The later Wittgenstein says, no, that's not how it works. The language game of measurement isn't grounded in metaphysical necessity. It's grounded in a shared public sample. His classic example was the standard platinum iridium meter bar kept in Paris.
The physical object.
Yes. The physical existence and accessibility of that sample is absolutely necessary for the practical functioning, the integrity of the specific language game that uses the concept 1 meter defined by that bar.
But it's not necessary in some absolute metaphysical sense.
Yeah. Not at all. If, heaven forbid, some disaster destroyed that specific bar and all accurate copies, that particular language game, based on that standard, would simply break down or have to be reconstituted around a new sample or definition. The necessity is practical, conventional, tied to the game, not metaphysical.
So the stability and meaning of language become localized. They depend entirely on our shared conventions, our practices, the tools and samples we agree to use, rather than being grounded in some independent, necessary reality outside of human activity.
Precisely. And this leads him to draw another crucial distinction, this time between different kinds of statements or propositions we make within these language games. First, there are ordinary propositions that have sense. These describe contingent states of affairs in the world, things like it's raining outside or the cat is on the mat. It could be true, could be false, depending on how the world is.
Okay, standard descriptive statements.
Right. But second, there are what he calls logical or more broadly grammatical propositions. These don't describe the world. They express the rules of the language game itself. Things like a bachelor is an unmarried man, or a cube has 6 sides, or even this color is red, pointing to a sample.
So they're like definitions or rules of the game.
Exactly. They don't tell you a fact about the world in the same way It's Raining does. Instead, they sort of license you. They give you the framework for describing the world in a certain way. They articulate the rules we follow when we use concepts like bachelor or cube or red.
And this has big implications for what it means to understand language, right? It's not about grasping some hidden mental object or meaning.
Absolutely. For the later Wittgenstein, understanding isn't about having a particular mental state or getting a Fregen thought in your head. It's about practical competence. It's about mastering the technique of the language game.
Knowing how to play the game.
Yes. Our understanding, our mastery, is fundamentally shown in our ability to use the words correctly, to follow the rules, to participate competently in the shared linguistic behavior. We might try to explain a rule or point to a sample to say what we mean, but that act of saying is just another move within the game. It's an expression of our understanding. It doesn't constitute the understanding itself.
So the real understanding is implicit in the practice.
It's in the know-how. It's something that ultimately has to be shown through skillful participation, not captured exhaustively by saying something about it.
Okay, that deep tension we talked about between Frege's objective logic and the later Wittgenstein's focus on social use really sets the stage perfectly for the next big philosophical battleground. Let's look at the logical empiricist project. They seem to be trying to bridge that gap, in a way, by formalizing the link between meaning and empirical evidence.
That's a good way to put it. The logical empiricists, who were most famously associated with the Vienna Circle in the 1920s and 30s, were deeply committed to empiricism, the idea that knowledge comes primarily from sensory experience. They wanted to integrate this empiricism directly into their theory of language and meaning. A key move was to redefine a priori truth knowledge we supposedly have independent of experience.
Like mathematical truths or logical ones?
Right. They argue that these aren't mysterious insights into a non-empirical realm. Instead, a priori truth should be reinterpreted simply as analytic truth, meaning a statement is true purely by virtue of the definitions or meanings of the words used in it. The classic example is, all bachelors are unmarried. You don't need to go out and survey bachelors. The truth is guaranteed by the definition of bachelor.
Okay, so they're trying to ground even logical truths in language conventions, in a sense. How did this connect to Frege?
They took Frege's core idea, his thesis that to understand a statement means to know what is the case if it is true, knowing its truth conditions, and they gave it a hard empirical twist. They transformed it into their central verificationist thesis. Understanding a statement and knowing the way of its verification is one and the same thing.
Ah, so understanding is knowing how to check if it's true, empirically.
Precisely. To understand a statement is to know the method, the empirical criterion, for confirming or falsifying it through observation or experiment. If a statement had no possible method of verification, even in principle, they famously declared it meaningless, literally nonsense.
Which got rid of a lot of traditional metaphysics.
That was the goal. Their ultimate aim was pretty radical, to construct an ideal language, primarily for science, that would be completely free of what they saw as meaningless metaphysical speculation. This ideal language would be built up from simple observation statements, directly anchored to experience, with clear empirical criteria for verification and falsification. Philosophy's job in this picture wasn't to speculate about reality, but rather to clarify the logic and syntax of this scientifically purified language.
That verificationist approach, meaning is the method of verification was incredibly influential for a time, but it ultimately ran into some pretty serious problems, didn't it?
It did face major challenges, particularly around how to verify universal laws, like all swans are white, which you can never fully confirm, and also theoretical statements in science that aren't directly observable.
Right. So let's move on to someone who took the truth-conditional idea in a different direction, someone deeply influenced by formal logic, but steering away from strict verificationism. Donald Davidson. He used Alfred Tarski's work on truth in a novel way.
Yes, Davidson's approach is heavily indebted to Tarski, but it's important to remember what Tarski was originally trying to do. Tarski wasn't primarily doing philosophy of language. He was a logician trying to solve a technical problem. How to define true for a formal language without falling into semantic paradoxes like the liar paradox. This sentence is false.
Okay.
To do this, he proposed a criterion that any adequate definition of truth must meet. He called it the condition of material adequacy, and it's captured by his famous Convention T.
Convention T. That sounds like the key technical piece here. What is it exactly?
Convention T essentially says that a satisfactory theory of truth for a given language, let's call it the object language, must allow you to derive for every single sentence as in that language a corresponding statement of the form. S is true if and only if P.
Okay, break that down. What it is in P.
Is as here is the name of the sentence in the object language. You usually form this name by putting the sentence in quotation marks. So the sentence is, snow is white.
Then as is snow is white.
Right, and P is the translation of that sentence into the language you're using to state the theory, the meta-language. So if our meta-language is English, P would just be snow is white, without quotes.
So the whole thing would be snow is white is true if and only if snow is white.
Exactly. Tarski said your truth theory has to entail all such T sentences for the language you're analyzing. Crucially, Tarski used the notion of meaning, specifically translation, which he took as understood, in order to define truth for his formal systems.
Okay, so Tarski provided the logical structure for defining truth, but he kind of assumed we already understood meaning or translation. How did Davidson manage to flip this and use a T theory as a theory of meaning itself, especially for a messy natural language like English?
That was Davidson's radical move. He basically said, let's turn Tarski's project on its head. Let's assume Tarski's formal structure, the T theory, is the right form for a theory of meaning. If we can actually construct a T theory for a natural language, crucially, he added, provided that theory is law-like and maximally simple, and it successfully generates all the correct T sentences for that language, then that T theory itself can serve as our philosophical account of meaning. Knowing the T theory is knowing the meaning.
Wow. So the theory that defines truth becomes a theory of meaning.
In a sense, yes. But it's important to note Davidson's stance towards the theoretical terms used within the T theory, especially things like reference, what words pick out, and satisfaction, what predicates apply to. He adopted a kind of instrumentalist view, meaning he didn't think we needed to discover some deep metaphysical facts about what reference really is. Reference and satisfaction are just theoretical tools, necessary posits that an interpreter uses to construct a working T theory for the language they're trying to understand. The interpreter's job is just to find a theory that works, one that allows them to interpret the speakers.
But wait, if it's just about finding a theory that works, couldn't there be many different T theories that generate the right T sentences? How does the interpreter choose what constrains the process?
That's an absolutely crucial question. Davidson realized this and proposed two fundamental guiding presumptions that any interpreter must make when constructing a T theory for an unknown language. These are constraints on finding an adequate theory. The first is the famous principle of charity. This is the idea that you have to start by assuming that the speakers you're interpreting are, by and large, rational, and that their utterances are mostly true, especially about things in their immediate observable environment.
You assume they're not constantly wrong or lying about basic stuff?
Exactly. You wouldn't get anywhere if you assumed they were massively mistaken about everything. You have to assume a background of largely true beliefs to even start interpreting. The second principle, closely related, is the principle of humanity. This is the assumption that the natives are, well, human like us. They have beliefs, desires, intentions, and they act in ways that are broadly rational and coherent given their environment and their likely goals. You assume their mental life makes sense.
Okay, so charity is about truth, humanity is about rationality.
Right. And Davidson's claim was that any T theory that successfully generates the right T sentences, while also maximizing the truth and rationality you attribute to the speakers, consistent with these principles, that theory is sufficient for interpretation. And if it's sufficient for interpretation, he argued, it's sufficient to count as giving the meaning of their utterances.
That sounds quite elegant, almost minimalist in a way.
Yeah.
But I know this view wasn't universally accepted. Michael Dummett in particular had some strong criticisms, right? He argued Davidson's theory was too modest.
Yes. Dummett launched a really powerful critique. His central point was that Davidson's T theory approach, focusing only on truth conditions derived via charity and humanity, might account for reference what words pick out, the extensional side of meaning, but it fundamentally misses something crucial: faith-heuristic sense.
Back to Frege's distinction.
Exactly. Dummett argued that a theory of meaning needs to explain what a speaker knows when they understand their language. Just knowing the truth conditions derived externally by an interpreter doesn't seem to capture the speaker's internal grasp, their cognitive understanding, the Fregen sense. Davidson's theory, for Dummett, only tells us how to interpret, not what understanding consists in for the speaker themselves.
So Dummett wanted to shift the focus away from these objective, externally assigned truth conditions and back towards something closer to the speaker's actual knowledge or justification, back towards assertability conditions.
Precisely. For Dummett, the primary goal of a theory of meaning shouldn't be truth conditions, but assertability conditions. What counts is knowing the conditions under which a speaker is warranted in asserting a sentence. He focused on the idea of canonical evidence, or criteria. Understanding a sentence P on this view means knowing what counts as conclusive or canonical evidence for asserting P. If you know when you're justified in claiming P, then you understand P.
Okay, but hang on. Knowing the conditions under which you're justified in asserting something, That sounds awfully similar to the logical empiricist verificationism, doesn't it? Meaning is tied to the evidence or proof procedure.
It does look very similar, and it faces many of the same challenges. A major objection is the persistent problem of holism and indeterminacy.
How so?
Well, if the evidence for or against any particular statement isn't isolated but depends on a whole network of other beliefs and background theories, that's holism, how can we ever specify determinate, context-independent assertability conditions for individual sentences? The evidence for one claim might involve dozens of others.
The justification conditions become incredibly complex and interconnected.
Right. And furthermore, the verificationists really struggled with defining what counts as canonical evidence. What looks like the definitive, rock-solid criterion today might be overturned by scientific progress tomorrow. Critics argue that the very notion of canonical status for evidence might just be a passing trait, something useful at a particular moment in inquiry, but not stable enough to define the meaning of a statement across all contexts and times. If meaning depends solely on identifying these specific canonical criteria, and those criteria are elusive or shifting, then meaning itself starts to look unstable, perhaps even indeterminate.
Right, we keep bumping up against this problem. Finding a fixed, stable basis for meaning seems incredibly difficult, whether it's truth conditions or assertability conditions. This leads us directly into what feels like the deepest crisis point in this whole discussion, the problem of semantic determination. What fact about the world or about me makes it the case that my word plus means addition and not something else? This is the absolute core of Saul Kripke's famous interpretation of Wittgenstein's rule-following considerations, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Kripke's skeptical argument, often called Wittgenstein, is just a masterpiece of philosophical disturbance. It forces you to confront a seemingly simple question with profound consequences. He asks you to consider basic arithmetic. You've used the plus sign plus countless times. You believe you mean addition by it. But, Kripke asks, what fact about your past usage, your mental state, or anything else determines that you meant addition plus, which yields a specific answer for all possible pairs of numbers, even ones you've never computed, rather than some other oddball algorithm? He invents one called quas. Let's say quas gives the same result as addition for all pairs of numbers you've actually calculated in your life, numbers less than, say, 57, but for any calculation involving numbers 57 or greater, it yields the answer 5.
Okay, that's weird, but possible.
The skeptical challenge is, based on your finite past behavior and internal states, what fact makes it true that you meant plus, and not quas? Your past usage is compatible with both rules.
My immediate intuition is just, but I know I meant addition. I had the rule in my head. But Kripke argues that doesn't work.
Exactly. The brilliance of the argument is how Kripke systematically examines all the plausible candidates for being this meaning-determining fact and shows why each one fails. First attempt. Appeal to mental instructions. Maybe you had an explicit instruction in your mind, like follow the standard algorithm for addition that you learned in school.
Right.
But Kripke points out, following Wittgenstein, that those instructions themselves contain general terms like standard algorithm or follow the rule. These terms also need interpretation. How do you know how to apply that rule? You'd need another rule to interpret the first rule.
Which needs another rule.
Yep.
Infinite regress. Okay, so mental instructions don't pin it down.
They just push the problem back. The second attempt Kripke considers is the dispositional account. Maybe meaning isn't an instruction, but a disposition. To mean addition is just to be disposed to give the sum, the answer given by the addition function, when asked to compute x plus y.
That sounds more promising. It's about behavior patterns.
It does, but it also fails. Why? Because human beings have finite dispositions. You aren't disposed to give the sum for all possible pairs of numbers. For incredibly huge numbers, you'd run out of time, memory, or just die before computing the answer. You might also make mistakes even for smaller numbers if you're tired or distracted.
So my actual dispositions don't match the infinite addition function perfectly.
Correct. Your finite dispositions are compatible with infinitely many different mathematical functions, including quest-like ones that only diverge on numbers too large for you to compute. Even idealized dispositions, what you would do if you had infinite capacity, seem problematic. How do we know what those are without already assuming the rule we're trying to ground?
Okay, dispositions fail too. What about appealing to internal experiences or mental images, like a feeling of getting it or picturing adding blocks?
Kripke addresses this too, drawing again on Wittgenstein. He argues that these experiences or samples, like having a mental image or a feeling of understanding or even remembering a specific example, can only ever function as illustrations or examples. They can be helpful within the practice of applying a rule, but they don't constitute the rule itself. A picture or a sample is just another item that itself requires interpretation. How do I know how to apply this sample or image to new, unseen cases? It doesn't provide the general specification needed. It still relies on a prior understanding of how it's supposed to be used, leading back towards the regress problem.
Wow, so every attempt to locate a specific isolated fact, whether it's an instruction, a disposition, or an experience within the individual, that could uniquely determine the correct application of the rule for all future cases. It seems to fail. What's the ultimate conclusion Kripke draws from this?
The skeptical conclusion, as Kripke presents it, is pretty devastating for certain traditional views of meaning. It's that there is no fact about an individual speaker, considered in isolation, that constitutes their meaning addition rather than quaddition by the plus sign. There's no internal state or property that fixes the classical realist truth conditions for the term across all possible applications.
Meaning just isn't in the head in that way.
Not in the way required by that kind of realism. But Kripke doesn't just leave us in skepticism. He attributes a skeptical solution to Wittgenstein.
A solution that accepts the skeptical conclusion but finds a different way forward.
Exactly. The solution says, okay, if no fact about the individual determines the meaning or the correct application, then we have to look outward to the community. Meaning isn't about matching some internal state to an objective rule. It's about participating in a shared practice. What makes my assertion 68 plus 57 equals 125 correct isn't some private mental fact, but the fact that this answer agrees with the checks and standards applied by the relevant linguistic community. My utterance is licensed because it conforms to the shared criteria, the accepted use.
So meaning becomes grounded in social agreement and practice, not individual mental facts or objective truth conditions in the classical sense.
Precisely. It forces us towards an understanding of meaning based on use within a community. It's often seen as an anti-realist approach because correctness is determined by conformity to practice, not by correspondence to some independent, pre-existing semantic fact about the individual.
Okay, that shift from trying to find an internal fact to grounding meaning in community use seems to solve the Kripkean puzzle. But it immediately throws up another massive challenge, doesn't it? The holist challenge to communication. If meaning depends on community use and context, how does that work if use itself seems holistic?
That's the next big hurdle. This challenge arises directly from views known as meaning holism or sometimes inferential role semantics. There are different flavors, but the core idea, let's call it FL holism, for Fodor and Lepore's target, is that the meaning or content of an expression, like a word or concept, is determined by its inferential role, its network of connections relative to many, or perhaps even all, other expressions in the language or system of beliefs.
So the meaning of dog isn't just about pointing to dogs, it's also about its links to animal, mammal, pet, barks, chases cats, and potentially everything else I believe about dogs.
That's the holistic idea, yes. The meaning is constituted by its place in the entire web of inferences and beliefs.
Okay, but then the problem seems obvious. If the meaning of dog depends on the totality of its connections in my belief system.
And my total belief system is almost certainly different from your total belief system, given our different experiences and knowledge.
Then it seems to follow logically that my concept of dog must be slightly different from your concept of dog. We don't have the exact same set of inferential connections.
Precisely. And if meaning is determined by this total role, and no two people share the exact same total role, then it looks like no two people ever share the exact same concept.
Which makes communication look impossible. How can we agree or disagree about dogs if we literally mean different things by the word dog?
That's the stark challenge. It seems like an absurdly high, unworkable standard for understanding public language. Philosophers Jerry Fodor and Ernie Lepore famously sharpened this objection into a tight dilemma specifically aimed against conceptual role semantics, CRS, which is the psychological version of meaning holism.
Okay, what was their dilemma?
Fodor and Lepore argued that CRS faces a destructive choice. Option A. If CRS claims that all of a concept's internal inferential roles, all the beliefs and connections involving it are relevant to determining its meaning.
Then, as we just said, since everyone's total set of beliefs is different, no two people share meanings, and communication, disagreement, and psychological generalizations become impossible. We're all trapped in our own idiosyncratic meaning systems.
Right, so option A looks disastrous. Option B, what if CRS tries to avoid this by saying only a subset of the inferential roles are relevant? Maybe only the really important defining or analytic connections matter for meaning, like dogs or animals.
That sounds more reasonable. Only the core inferences count.
It sounds reasonable, but Fodor and Lepore argue this move is also fatal. Because now CRS is committed to drawing a principled line between the meaning-constituting analytic inferences and the merely factual synthetic inferences.
And that's the analytic-synthetic distinction.
Exactly. And ever since W.V.O. Quine's famous critique in the mid-20th century, most philosophers have been deeply skeptical that such a sharp, principled distinction can actually be drawn. Quine argued persuasively that there's no clear boundary between truths based purely on meaning and truths based on worldly facts. It's all interconnected.
So if option B requires resurrecting the analytic-synthetic distinction, which is widely seen as untenable,
then option B fails too. And if both option A and option B lead to disaster, Fodor and Lepore conclude, then CRS itself must be false. Holism about meaning seems to lead to paradox.
that's a powerful argument. Is there any way around it? Does holism inevitably make communication impossible or rely on a dubious distinction?
Well, there is a potential counter-argument, a way to push back against the force of the dilemma. It often gets a bit lost in the debate, but it's crucial. The key idea is to challenge the assumption that a difference in the determinants of content must necessarily lead to a difference in the determined content itself.
Okay, unpack that. Determinants versus determined content.
Think of it with an analogy. Consider the property being an even number. Many different mathematical procedures or descriptions, the determinants, can pick out the number 4, and many different ones can pick out the number 6. These determinants are different.
Right.
But the determined property being even is the same for both 4 and 6. The difference in how we arrive at the number doesn't automatically mean the property we're interested in. Evenness is different.
Okay, I see the analogy. How does that apply to meaning?
The suggestion is that two people might have slightly different total webs of belief and inference involving dog, different determinants. You might believe dogs evolved from wolves. I might not know that. You might think poodles are intelligent. I might disagree. However, these differences in the underlying belief network, the determinants, don't necessarily mean that the public meaning or the concept of dog that we deploy in communication, the determined content, is fundamentally different in a way that blocks understanding.
So the Fodor-Lepore argument assumes that any difference in the total inferential role must equal a difference in meaning, but maybe that's too strict.
That's the counter-argument. Perhaps the way content is individuated, the way we decide if two people mean the same thing, isn't nearly as fine-grained as the total inferential role. Public language might work precisely because we tolerate minor variations in underlying beliefs and focus on a shared core of salient inferences sufficient for practical communication. The holism might be true at the level of total belief systems, but meaning itself might be more robust and public-facing than that implies.
Okay, this whole tangled debate about semantic determination, whether it's internal rules, dispositions, or community practice, inevitably pushes us towards fundamental metaphysical questions. Where exactly is meaning located? Is it primarily something inside our heads, or is it shaped by the world outside us? This brings us squarely into the huge debate between externalism and internalism, famously crystallized by Hilary Putnam's twin Earth thought experiment.
Absolutely. This debate gets right to the heart of the relationship between mind, language, and the external world. Externalism, which was powerfully championed by Putnam and also Tyler Burge, makes a pretty radical claim. It says that the semantic properties of many of our words, what they mean, and consequently, even the contents of our thoughts involving those words, depend crucially on features of our social or physical environment that are outside our individual psychological states, meaning ain't just in the head, as Putnam famously put it.
Right, meanings just ain't in the head. Let's walk through the twin Earth thought experiment, because it's probably the most influential argument for this view.
Okay. Imagine Earth back in, say, 1750, before the discovery of modern chemistry. And imagine there's a distant planet, twin Earth, which is an exact molecule-for-molecule duplicate of Earth in almost every respect. People look the same, speak the same languages, have the same buildings, trees, everything seems identical.
Got it. A perfect replica.
Almost perfect. There's one crucial difference unknown to the inhabitants. On Earth, the clear, drinkable liquid that fills the lakes and rivers, the stuff everyone calls water, has the chemical structure H2O. On twin Earth, however, the liquid that looks, tastes, smells, and behaves exactly like our water, the stuff they call water, has a different chemical structure. Let's call it XYZ.
Okay, so identical appearance and function, but different underlying nature.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Now consider Oscar on Earth in 1750 and his exact physical duplicate, twin Oscar, on twin Earth. Since they are molecule-for-molecule duplicates, they are also internally identical in all psychological respects. Their brain states, their sensations, their beliefs as far as they know them, their dispositions to use the word water, all identical.
Right. From the skin in, they're the same.
Yes. But here's the externalist punchline. When Oscar on Earth uses the word water, his word refers to XYZ. When Twin Oscar on Twin Earth uses the word water, his word refers to XYZ.
Even though they are internally identical?
Exactly. They are in the same psychological state, but their word water refers to two completely different kinds of stuff. And this difference in reference seems to be determined entirely by the nature of the substance in their external environment that they have causally interacted with.
So the conclusion is,
The meaning, at least the referential component of the word water, and arguably the content of their thoughts about water, must be different for Oscar and Twin Oscar despite their internal identity. Therefore, meaning, or at least this aspect of it, just ain't in the head. It depends on external reality.
that is a really compelling argument for externalism. How do internalists push back against this? Especially those coming from linguistics, maybe someone like Chomsky, who tend to focus more on the internal language faculty.
Right. Internalists, particularly those in the Chomskyan tradition of linguistics, often view these externalist arguments as interesting philosophical puzzles, but perhaps somewhat peripheral to the primary goal of linguistics. Their focus is typically on characterizing the speaker's internalized linguistic competence, the grammar, the rules stored in the mind-brain. They champion what's sometimes called the idiolectal view.
Idiolect meaning the individual's personal language system.
Exactly. They argue that the scientifically interesting object of study is the organization of the individual's language faculty, the internal system, abstracting away from these external social factors or the specific chemical composition of things in the world. The focus is on the language system within the individual body-mind.
Okay, but even if you focus on the idiolect, the individual's internal system, doesn't the internalist still have to grapple with how that idiolect relates to the public language? There's a tricky issue about error, isn't there?
Yeah, there is, and it's a crucial point where internalism and externalism seem to intersect, actually. Consider a speaker whose idiolect differs from the common usage in the community. For instance, maybe someone grows up using the word livid to mean flushed and angry, rather than its traditional meaning of pale or ashen. Is this just a mere difference in their personal dialect, their idiolect? Or is it a genuine, real error relative to the public language?
It feels like it depends on whether they think they're using the public word or just their own word.
Exactly right. It seems to depend crucially on the speaker's own intentions and attitudes towards the public standard. Let's take a different example. Suppose someone mistakenly believes that a legally binding contract must be a written document. A lawyer corrects them, explaining that oral agreements can also be contracts. The person likely accepts the correction and changes their usage. Why? Because they recognize they were mistaken about the public, established meaning of the legal term contract. That feels like a real error. Now contrast that with someone who decides to use, say, made-up word funord in a very specific, idiosyncratic way within their own diary, and they have no intention of conforming to how anyone else might use it, if anyone else did. If someone corrects them, they might just shrug it off. That feels like a mere difference of idiolect.
So the difference between error and mere difference isn't purely internal. It depends on the speaker's stance towards the public language.
That seems to be the key insight. The distinction hinges on the individual speaker's intention to be answerable to a public standard. If the speaker intends for their use of contract or water or livid to align with the established public use, then external standards, legal definitions, chemical composition, common usage, become relevant to judging their usage as correct or incorrect, regardless of their internal psychological state. The social and external dimensions creep back in, even when considering the idiolect.
Let's pull back for a moment and revisit the historical roots of this anxiety about internal mental states determining meaning. We mentioned Frege earlier. He had this deep, profound worry about something he called psychologism. Why was making truth or meaning dependent on individual minds considered such a philosophical sin for him?
Frege's opposition to psychologism was absolutely fundamental to his entire project. He believed that objectivity, especially the objectivity of logic and truth, was paramount and utterly non-negotiable. His great fear was that if truth were somehow dependent on our acknowledging it, or on the specific psychological processes of individual thinkers, if something could be true for me but false for you, then the whole basis of rational discourse and science would collapse.
Awesome.
Because, as he argued, if truth is subjective, then there would be no contradiction between the opinions of different people. If my true and your true are just reflections of our internal states, we can never genuinely disagree or correct each other. He famously said that transgressing the requirement that truth is independent of our acknowledgement eliminates the very possibility of science, which relies on objective facts, and it eliminates the possibility of error and the correction of error. If there's no objective standard, there's nothing to be wrong about.
So truth must be answerable to something outside our individual minds, to how things are.
Yes, in a public, objective sense.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be hostage to the peculiarities of human psychology or the varying attitudes or senses held by different thinkers. This conviction was especially strong when it came to the laws of logic itself.
Why logic in particular?
Because Frege believed logical laws must be absolutely universal. They must apply to any possible thought, regardless of who or what is doing the thinking, a human, an alien intelligence, a perfectly rational computer. Logic captures something that a thinker must recognize or conform to in order to count as a thinker at all. Therefore, logical laws must be hostage to nothing about the specific cognitive makeup of humans. They needed a foundation completely independent of psychology.
Okay, so we've seen arguments suggesting that reference, at least for some terms like water, seems externally determined and objective, aligning with Frege's desire for objectivity. Let's dig up deeper now into what reference actually involves. What is the core or essence of reference? And how does this relate to Kripke's ideas about rigidity?
That's a great question. A useful way to think about the essence of reference comes from the philosopher R.M. Sainsbury. He suggests, roughly, that it's constitutive of a genuinely referring expression, like a name or maybe a demonstrative, that how things are with its actual referent matters crucially to the truth or falsehood of sentences containing that expression. And importantly, this connection holds across different possible scenarios or possible worlds. What the actual thing is like affects truth, no matter how we imagine things might have been different. Reference, in its core, seems to have this modal dimension built in.
Okay, that sounds like it connects directly to Saul Kripke's extremely influential notion of rigid designators.
It connects perfectly. Kripke defined a rigid designator as a term that refers to the very same object with respect to every possible world in which that object exists. It picks out the same individual across all counterfactual scenarios.
The classic example being proper names.
Exactly. Kripke argued that ordinary proper names, like Aristotle or Nixon, are rigid designators. The name Aristotle refers to that specific individual, Aristotle, in our actual world. But it would also refer to that same individual in a possible world where he decided to become a fisherman instead of a philosopher, or a world where he died young, or even a world where he didn't actually teach Alexander the Great.
So the name sticks to the individual, regardless of what properties that individual happens to have in different possible circumstances.
Precisely. And this very rigidity was the core of Kripke's famous modal argument against the traditional description theories of names.
Right, the theory that names are just disguised descriptions.
Yes, the view associated with Frege and Russell that a name like Aristotle is basically shorthand for a definite description or a cluster of descriptions, like the teacher of Alexander the Great or the author of the Metaphysics born in Stagera.
How did rigidity challenge that?
Kripke's argument was devastatingly simple. He pointed out that descriptions are generally not rigid. The description, the teacher of Alexander the Great, refers to Aristotle in our world. But in a different possible world, maybe Plato taught Alexander. In that world, the description, the teacher of Alexander, would refer to Plato, not Aristotle.
Ah, so the description picks out different people in different worlds.
Right. But the name Aristotle, Kripke argued intuitively, still refers to Aristotle even in that world where he didn't teach Alexander. Since names are rigid and descriptions generally are not, names cannot simply be equivalent to descriptions.
So the reference of a name must be fixed in some other way.
Kripke suggested it's usually fixed through an initial baptism or naming ceremony, and then passed down through a historical causal chain of communication. The reference is determined externally by this causal link back to the original individual, not by any description the speaker has in their head.
Okay, this picture of rigid reference, fixed externally, sounds very neat and tidy, especially for formal logic. But I know there's a crucial debate in more recent philosophy of language that complicates this picture by drawing a sharp line between the speaker's act of referring and the expression's own property of referring.
Yes, this is a really important distinction that challenges how central semantic reference really is to communication. We need to distinguish. speaker reference. This is the intentional act performed by a person using an expression on a particular occasion to pick something out, to draw attention to something. It's about the speaker's intentions in context. Linguistic or semantic reference. This is supposed to be an inherent property of the expression itself, like the name Aristotle or the demonstrative that, which makes it automatically introduce its referent into the proposition being expressed, independent of the speaker's specific intentions on that occasion, beyond the intention to use the word with its standard meaning.
Okay, speaker's act versus words property. Why is this distinction so important?
It becomes critical when you consider what's sometimes called the embarrassingly simple argument, ESA. This argument, developed by several philosophers, suggests that maybe this property of semantic reference is actually quite rare, or perhaps even unnecessary for explaining how most singular terms work in communication. The core idea is that most types of singular terms, things like demonstratives, this, that book, complex demonstratives, that tall man drinking a martini, non-pure indexicals, he, she, and perhaps even proper names, can all be used perfectly, literally, and intelligibly in ways that are non-referential.
Wait, how can you use a term like that book literally but non-referentially? Isn't its whole point to refer?
Consider a scenario. You're setting rules for a library. You point to an empty shelf and say, that book, which will be the millionth book donated, must be placed here. Are you referring to a specific book? No, because no such book exists yet. You are using the demonstrative phrase, that book, literally to specify a condition or identify a future role, but you aren't picking out a particular object in the world and making it part of your statement. There is no specific res thing your thought is about.
So I'm using the linguistic form, but there's no actual referent being introduced into the proposition.
Exactly. Or think about Kripke's example. The first child born in the 22nd century will be bald. We understand the sentence perfectly well, but we aren't referring to a specific child who exists now. The definite description is used literally but non-referentially. The ESA suggests that if these terms, which are supposedly prime examples of referring expressions, can be used literally without actually referring in the sense of introducing a specific object into the proposition, then maybe their semantic reference property isn't doing the work we thought it was.
So what is doing the work in communication?
The argument suggests that perhaps semantic reference, for many terms, is an otiose property.
Lotios.
Meaning it's superfluous, serving no real function, dispensable. It might be a useful stipulation for building formal logical models, like Tarski-style semantics, but it might not be a necessary feature for explaining how humans actually understand each other using these terms in everyday language.
So this Kripkean notion of rigid semantic reference might be more of a logician's construct imposed on language, rather than a fundamental feature of natural language communication itself that completely flips the script.
It certainly presents a serious challenge to views that place semantic reference at the core of meaning for singular terms. The alternative, more pragmatic view suggests that understanding doesn't rely on grasping the expression's inherent referential link. Instead, the audience just figures out what the speaker plausibly intends to communicate, given the context, the words used, and general principles like charity and relevance. What object or idea is the speaker reasonably likely to be trying to talk about here? On this view, the purported inherent referential property of the expression itself, except maybe for a few pure indexicals like I, here, now, whose reference is automatically fixed by context, plays little or no direct role in the listener's process of recognizing what is being discussed. It's pragmatics and intention recognition doing the heavy lifting.
This blurring of the lines, where speaker intention and context seem to do so much work, inevitably forces us right back to that fundamental boundary issue. The line between semantics, supposedly context-independent linguistic meaning, and pragmatics, meaning derived from context of utterance.
Yes, exactly. The idea that we can neatly separate the fixed, literal meaning of a sentence from the contribution of context is constantly under pressure. Formal semantics often tries to assign complete, truth-evaluable propositions as the semantic value of sentences. But this runs into serious problems with what are sometimes called cases of the incomplete proposition or semantic underdetermination.
Give me an example.
Think about simple sentences like Igor is tall, or Louise is ready, or steel isn't strong enough. Grammatically, these seem like complete, meaningful sentences.
Yeah, they seem fine.
But do they express a complete thought, something that can be strictly true or false just based on the words themselves? Arguably not. Igor is tall compared to what? Jockeys, basketball players, children. Until a comparison class is specified by the context, the sentence doesn't seem to have definite truth conditions.
Right. And Louise is ready. Ready for what? ready for dinner, ready for her exam, ready to leave.
Exactly. Steel isn't strong enough. For what purpose? To build a bridge, to make a watch spring. The sentence fragment seems to only provide a kind of propositional, radical, and incomplete thought structure.
It's like a sentence from a Mad Libs game, waiting for the context to fill in the crucial blanks.
That's a great analogy. The purely linguistic meaning derived from the lexicon and syntax seems to provide only this incomplete logical form. It's the speaker's intentions and the shared context, the pragmatics, that have to fill in the blanks to yield a complete truth-evaluable proposition, sometimes called the explicature.
So does this mean traditional semantics focused on truth conditions is just wrong?
Not necessarily wrong, but it probably needs modification. One popular way to handle this is to say that many predicates like tall, ready, strong enough, flat, empty, actually work a bit like indexicals. I hear, now. They retain a stable, context-independent semantic character or linguistic meaning. Tall always relates to height. Ready always relates to preparedness. But their extension, the set of things they actually apply to, varies dramatically depending on the standards set by the context of utterance.
So tall always means tallness. But what counts as tall depends on whether we're talking about jockeys or skyscrapers.
Precisely. Semantics gives you the type of property, but pragmatics, reading the context, sets the specific threshold or comparison class needed for applying that property and getting a determinate truth value. The boundary is definitely blurry, and pragmatics seems to infiltrate deeply into what we might have thought was pure semantics.
Wow. Okay, so we've traced this incredible arc, starting with massive ambition for language to unlock reality, hitting a profound crisis about whether meaning can even be fixed internally, exploring the push-pull between internal mind and external world, and finally realizing how deeply entangled linguistic meaning is with context and speaker intention.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? And that central tension remains absolutely alive and well in the field today. Is meaning ultimately grounded in objective facts about how the world is tied to truth and reference, like Frege or maybe the externalist hoped? Or is meaning fundamentally a function of how we use it within our shared practices and communities tied to use and assertability, as the later Wittgenstein, Dummett, and perhaps the rule-following considerations suggest?
Truth versus use.
That's still a major fault line. But the field is far from static. You see these debates playing out in fascinating new areas, like trying to figure out the semantics of predicates of personal taste. This chili is tasty. Is that objective, subjective? How do we disagree about it? Or the ongoing work exploring the very deep, intricate relationship between the structure of our thoughts and the structure of the language we use to express them. The debates are definitely not over.
Thinking back through all this, what stands out perhaps most provocatively for me is the implication of that embarrassingly simple argument about reference. If, for many of the singular terms we use constantly names, demonstratives, their supposed inherent ability to refer rigidly is often just a kind of formal stipulation, a useful tool for logicians perhaps, but not essential for communication. And if we actually rely almost entirely on the flexibility of context, intention reading, and shared social practices to understand each other, what does that really imply but the kind of certainty or fixedness we usually assume our words possess when we use them every day?
That is, I think, the perfect question to leave our listeners with. It cuts right to the practical core of all this philosophical debate. If we believe that knowledge, philosophical insight included, is most valuable when we can somehow understand it and maybe even apply it, then perhaps you, the listener, should consider this. In your own daily conversations, in your reading, in your writing, when are you really staking your claim on what you believe is a rigid, fixed, externally guaranteed meaning of a term, like pinning it down to a specific fact or object? And when, perhaps more often than you realize, are you actually relying on the inherent flexibility, the shared understanding, the give and take of a social language game, a communal practice to ensure that you are understood and that you understand others? Are you always saying precisely what you mean with reference fixed, or are you often just showing what you mean through your participation in the game, trusting the shared context to do the work?